Today's topic is one that's relevant to all of us and every human on Earth as we age. I was actually surprised by the figure that over 17% of the population is now over the age of 65, and that's a number that, of course, will continue to grow. Many of our 2022 vanguards have dealt with aging. We've had presentations on the genetics and biological hallmarks of aging, as well as the chronic diseases like dementia and cardiovascular disease, for which aging is a major risk factor. We've also had presentations on emerging therapies that have been demonstrated, at least in animal models, to increase lifespan, as well as drugs that are under investigation at this very moment to evaluate their effect on health span. So as I cling to, by the skin of my teeth, to what Levinson described as middle adult era, I am looking forward to hearing how we can redefine and reconceptualize older age and embrace the physical and mental maturation process and the benefits and many positive attributes of getting older, as Dr. Agronin has described in the material that he disseminated. So as an adult and geriatric psychiatrist, Dr. Agronin is a national expert in Alzheimer's disease and other geriatric mental health issues. And he runs both a memory center and one of Florida's largest Alzheimer's clinical research programs. The author of 10 books, including the acclaimed How We Age, A Doctor's Journey into the Heart of Growing Old, and its sequel, The End of Old Age, Living a Longer, More Purposeful Life. So it's my distinct pleasure to introduce Dr. Marc Agronin, who will speak to us on The End of Old Age, a strength-based approach to redefining how we age. Dr. Agronin, thank you so much for being here. We look forward to your presentation.
David, thank you so much, and thank you so much for the introduction. I really, truly, is an honor for me to be here. You have such a distinguished group of individuals that I'm very humbled to speak to all of you this evening, and I'm really excited about this and to bring a perspective on aging, which I've come to discover over the many years of working with aging individuals. I always like to start off with different stories. I think that really gives a good illustration. But before doing that, let me just give everyone a very warm greeting, or a semi-warm greeting, from Miami. This is a photograph of Miami Jewish Health, which is roughly 22-acre campus located right in the heart of Miami. We've been around now for over 80 years, serving the whole diversity of communities in Miami, with everything ranging from long-term care to skilled nursing. I run our memory disorder center and behavioral health on campus. We have community programs, independent living, assisted living, hospice, really just about everything. And it's a beautiful setting and a really special place. And I've been there now for 23 years. What's really touched me is all the amazing, incredible individuals with whom I've worked, some of whom have really extraordinary stories. I hope to share a few with you this evening and really tell you what I've learned from them over time. So with that, I want to begin with a question, and that is, what do you think about aging? And really have all of us reflect for a few moments about how we consider our own aging and what aspirations we might have for our aging. So I'm going to give you this following question. If I told you that I have 3 different choices which could potentially cure old age, I'm curious which one you'd choose. So let me present these 3 to you. So the first one is a bottle of water from the Fountain of Youth. And if you've been to Florida, you can go to St. Augustine. There's a park, supposedly the spot where Ponce de Leon and his crew first stepped foot on the United States continent. And they actually have a small well there, and you can buy Fountain of Youth water. So that's your first choice. The second is one of the many youth restore potions, tonics, lotions that you can buy at almost any drugstore that you walk into, which offers fantastic promises to restore youth or rejuvenate your brain, or one of many different such claims. And finally, your third choice is a little offbeat, chocolate, wine, and cigarettes. I'm not endorsing any particular lifestyles here, so maybe we'll focus more on the chocolate and wine, but I can't really have everyone do a show of hands. I'm guessing if I gave you these choices, I know which one most people might choose. You know, we realize this Fountain of Youth water is nothing more than a gimmick, despite the fact that you can go there and they will sell you bottles of this water. Truth be told, most of the brain potions, tonics, lotions are nothing more than the claims behind them. And the only person really benefiting from them are the individuals who are grinding them up, producing them, and selling them. So what about chocolate and wine and cigarettes? Well, why would I include that here? I think maybe that would be, most of us would choose at least part of that concoction. So obviously there's a story behind this, and the story has to do with Madame Calment. You might be familiar with her, a French lady who was the oldest verified individual in history. She lived to 122 years, 164 days. And when asked about her secret to long life, she said, well, every week she has several pounds of French chocolate. Every day she has a glass of port wine. And at least up into the age of 116, she had 2 cigarettes every day. Fascinating woman. She remembers seeing the Eiffel Tower being built when she was a young girl. Her father ran a fabric store and sold other supplies, and she remembers this very scruffy and somewhat unpleasant artist who used to hang around the shop by the name of Vincent van Gogh. And interesting story that when she was in her 90s, a enterprising French attorney made a deal with her. He said, how about this? I will pay you a yearly annuity, and upon your death, I will receive your property. And she thought, sounds like a good idea, somewhat of a French version of a reverse mortgage. Took the deal. Unfortunately, by the time she passed along, he was long gone, and his widow and children were still paying Madame Calment. So it turned out to be a pretty good deal for her. I think the point here being that maybe there really is no true secret to living longer. In fact, if you look at many long-lived individuals, you will find that there are so-called secrets run the gamut. In fact, the oldest living American woman died a number of years ago at the age of 116. Her secret was every day she ate 4 strips of bacon. So again, I'm not yet endorsing any lifestyles. We'll get to that at the end of the talk. But when we think about the secrets of living longer, I think we envision, on the one hand, maybe we would like to live this long. We put some conditions on it, but we'd certainly like to know what's the true secret to living there. Now, Enrica van Andelschipper lived to be 115. And what's interesting, when they asked what her secret was, she said a glass of orange juice every day. I think that we could endorse that. It makes sense. Along with pickled herring. I've taken a little bit of artistic license here. I'm not sure if she combined the two, but what's remarkable is when she was 112, she went through a series of neuropsychological tests and actually scored about at the level of an average 70-year-old. And upon autopsy, she donated her brain to science. They remarkably found very few of the telltale signs of brain aging that we will talk about shortly, such as amyloid plaques and tau tangles. Really extraordinary life. But again, what we find here is we don't really know what the secret is. Could it be a combination of genetics, lifestyle? Usually when you speak to individuals who live 100 and above, and incidentally, 100, the centenarians are the fastest growing age group in the country at this point, we often don't find the sort of secrets that we might imagine. Nonetheless, there are many different perspectives we bring to aging. And one of them is this notion of what we would like to aspire to or look like. If you look at the advertising for any assisted living facility, any continuing retirement community in the country, you will see photos like this showing our aging selves as quite vigorous, happy, joyful. It gives us a certain perspective, and I will talk about how there is certainly a lot of truth to this. Certainly what's happened over time is these aspirations, in some ways, as we are living longer, healthier lives, have morphed into a focus on what I call the bucket list mentality. And this is something I would describe as the following. As people are able to entertain a lifestyle enabled by longer, healthier, and fitter lives, early retirement, disposable income, this explosion of internet-based senior travel companies, just as one example, for those individuals who are able to do this. Now, again, that's a limited pool, but for those who are able to, it's certainly something promoted by social media. These are the images of aging that we think is how we ought to be. I think this bucket list mentality prioritizes personal pleasure over family and community, needs and goals to some extent. There's a philosophy of now or never, of being rather than becoming. It's a sense of, hey, you've lived this long. If you've got the means to do it, just do it. The problem is that this is one particular perspective on aging that really is dependent on aging looking good and really going well. What happens when we look at the reality of aging? How do we still maintain a positive attitude towards it? And that's a lot of what I want to explore tonight, is these different views of aging and how sometimes we get caught up in views that either are stereotyped in one way or the other, and we really ignore what the science says about the potential we face. So let me tell you a very different story, but impart a lesson that I learned. And I think I learned this in one way or another every day in which I go to work. And I primarily work with individuals in their 80s and 90s, with many centenarians. And obviously, people come to me as a geriatric psychiatrist when they're really in dire straits. So a number of years ago at the nursing home, I got a call. And this is not someone who you'd see on a bucket list or jumping in the air for joy. They described a woman in her mid-90s, had been living at home with her husband, who died precipitously. And within several weeks, her family said, we can't care for her at home. And she ended up in the nursing home. And the nurses were quite concerned that she was depressed. And my instructions were basically go see her and get her started on an antidepressant. So I went to the room to see her, and I walked in. The room was dark. She was sitting in a wheelchair on the far end of the room in front of the shades. That was the only bit of illumination in the room. And I felt so badly hearing her story. I walked in thinking, wow, she must be quite distressed and depressed. I'm not sure what I'm going to be able to do for her, but let me sit down and hear her story. So I sat down with her, and she looked at me, and I literally was feeling so badly for her. I took her hand and I said, I'm so sorry about your loss. What's it been like for you after so many years of being married and now suddenly finding yourself here? And she looked up at me, and with somewhat of a funny look on her face, she said, heaven. And I did a double take. I thought, heaven? What are you talking about? And she saw how confused I was. She said, doctor, let me tell you, it wasn't such a good marriage. They had been married 72 years. She said he was a gruff individual. They never got along that well. So I said, well, why did you stay together? She said, well, I stayed together for the children. I said, well, how old are your children now? Well, they're in their 70s. In fact, I used to see several of her daughters pushing her on her wheelchair across campus. I think they were less fit than she was. The point being is that she was not depressed. She was not distressed at being in the nursing home. Quite the opposite. This was a new lease on life for her. She was looking forward to it. In fact, she thrived. She threw herself into activity. She was involved with the community. It truly was heaven for her, because she felt that she was liberated in a sense to really live life the way she wanted to. This threw me completely. And what I realized is that what I imagined she was experiencing was completely wrong. And I didn't follow this warning from the American psychologist, William James. And in the Principles of Psychology, he wrote quite famously, he said, the great snare of the psychologist is the confusion of his own standpoint with that of the mental fact about which he is making his report. I shall hereafter call this the psychologist's fallacy par excellence. In essence, William James was saying, don't mistake your own thoughts or feelings for what the other person is experiencing. I think we do this with older individuals all the time, because we project ourselves into their circumstances, and we often imagine depression and distress and anxiety and other perspectives which might not be there. But we get stuck on these, and these become part of the way we look at aging, how we view it. And we bring this into the clinic, we bring this into our research, we bring this into our own lives. So in essence, from my lesson learned, I want to challenge this during the rest of the presentation this evening. So let's get into the science of it. And let me start with just the basics. How do we define aging? I'm going to take a standard scientific definition. This is from Robert Arking's book, The Biology of Aging. And he describes aging as, quote, a time-dependent series of cumulative, progressive, intrinsic, and deleterious functional and structural changes that usually begin to manifest themselves at reproductive maturity and eventually culminate in death. Not the cheeriest definition of aging, but I think we'd agree this sounds accurate. And when we think about aging, when we look at theories of aging, it's about that. It's about the accumulation of hits to our biological being that diminish us in many ways, slowly but steadily, until we eventually die. And so much of how we view aging, so much of the emphasis we put or don't put on enhancing aging has to do with this basic attitude. So I think that's a good place to start to really explore the reality of the situation. So, but I want to dwell on this for a while. And let me begin with a story about aging, which really, in my mind, is going to serve as a counterpoint to this definition. It's going to set the stage for the thesis I want to advance tonight. So the story is about a renowned artist born in 1869 in France. He was known for his bold use of color, of these lustrous colors on huge canvases. I took the liberty of imposing a picture of him on a ladder next to a colorful imprint of one of his works. But he was a very physical painter. In fact, he really came of age and came of great fame in the early 1900s with these really wonderfully colorful impressionistic scenes. So when he was in his early 70s, this is in 1941, after a really amazing career in art, he developed a severe illness. Belief it may have been duodenal cancer or some form of hernia. The bottom line was this: it's 1941. It's the height of the Second World War. The Germans have overrun France. Most of his friends, family were either in exile or hiding. His wife had left him. His daughter had been taken away by the Gestapo for working with the French underground. He was really bereft of just about everything. And now he's, in essence, lying on his deathbed with a severe illness. And the only choice was to undergo surgery. Again, this is at the time, there were no IV fluids, no antibiotics. So it truly was looking like the end of the road for him. And we might liken this to so many individuals we see, usually in their 90s and above, who are severely ill, they're old, and really looking like it's the end of the road for them. Well, he underwent the surgery, barely survived, waxed and waned in delirium on and off for weeks to months, near death. But due to a very dedicated group of nurses, they brought him back to health. In fact, they called him le ressuscité, literally the man who returned from the dead. So he survived. He was alive, but bedbound or in a wheelchair. He simply could not engage in art the way he did in the past. He was not going to stand on any ladders. He wasn't going to stretch his body to paint on canvases. He could barely even get out of bed or the wheelchair. He himself believed that this was the end of line, that even if he lived, it would not be for very long. So he's lying in bed, and something very interesting happened. And this is a theme I'm going to come back to later when we talk about resilience. A memory from the past intruded. And this was about when he was an adolescent. He had had appendicitis, recuperated in bed for many, many months. His mother felt so badly for him, she didn't know what to do. So one day she brought him a gift. It was a small box. He opened it up. It was a little easel with canvas, some paints, some paintbrushes. And for the first time in his life, he began to create art from the confines of his bed. And he wrote about that time, he said, "I felt like a wild animal." Interesting that later in life, his group of artists were called the wild animals in terms of the type of art they produced. But he was liberated from his bed with art. And so he said to himself now, similarly, but he's an older man, maybe he can't go to the art, but the art can come to him. So he started illuminating cards from his bed, sending them to friends. And he came up with an idea. He had a very dedicated assistant, and he had her take these sheets of paper and paint these very bold and lustrous colors on them. She would bring the sheets of paper to him, and he would take a scissors, and from his bed or his wheelchair, he would cut out shapes and paste the shapes in books, have his assistant paste them on the wall. And literally, this old man near death in his deathbed created a new form of art, which began to revolutionize art and later fashion and advertising and design. This is an image from a book called Jazz, which he illustrated. Now, when you think of jazz, we think of liberation and improvisation, freedom, not the terms we equate with old age, but that was what it was becoming for him. His creation of these paper cutouts, he was productive until his death in 1954. So he lived for many years with this singular purpose, this art which he developed. And this is a work of his called Le Gerbe. Now, it's in French, it refers to like a sheath of wheat. Now, typically we think of a sheath of wheat as this tightly bound, colorless group of grasses. For him, you can see it's an explosion of color and form and movement. And I don't know if you've guessed who this is, but Matisse described this as his second life. And he said, I've needed all that time to reach the stage where I can say what I want to say. Aging for him was not about decrepitude and just death. I mean, certainly these were things he faced and worried about. It became about liberation, creativity, initiative. And, right before his death, he designed and created this amazing chapel in the south of France. This is a picture of him sitting in it. Everything from the priest's vestments to the windows to the designs on the wall. And he dedicated this to one of the nurses who saved his life, later became a nun. Remarkable end to his life at a time when he really defied all stereotypes and imaginings of what old age should be about, at a time when especially it was unheard of. For me, the question is, what can we learn from Matisse? I think there's a singular point here. Aging brings strengths. And if we don't recognize these strengths and see the science behind them, we are missing a fundamental part of the aging process that has to balance out all of the decline and negativity that is part of the aging process, but we too often let that define it. But I want to pause here because not everyone believes this. So let's deal with some of the stark realities of aging. So I'm not just putting up a beautiful picture here, but really talking about the reality based in science of both sides of it. Susan Jacoby had a fascinating book called Never Say Die, The Myth and Marketing of the New Old Age. And I think she expresses an attitude that many people have. It's great to be old as long as one does not manifest too many of the typical problems of advanced age. Anyone who has outlived his or her passions has lived too long. She makes a point that I think many people come to agree as they get older, that if you're healthy and fit, you can do what you want to do. Aging is great. If not, maybe it's time to get off the stage. What fascinates me is what Jacoby and many other writers today are saying is nothing new. In fact, to prove that to you, I want to quote from Cicero, the great Roman statesman and philosopher, because he wrote in his famous essay on old age in 44 BC the following: old age is the final act of life, as if a drama, and we ought to leave when the play grows wearisome, especially if we've had our fill. He's saying the exact same things that Jacoby is saying, but 2,000 years earlier. The Greeks said the same thing. The famous legend of immortality. The god Eos took Tithonus as a lover and asked Zeus to grant him immortality, but unfortunately forgot to ask for one important thing, and that was eternal youth. And so if you read Homer's poem on this, he writes about Tithonus. But when loathsome old age pressed full upon him and he could not move nor lift his limbs, she laid him in a room. There he babbles endlessly and no more has strength at all. So these characterizations of late life, of dementia, we've had since antiquity. And so these attitudes, these stereotypes have been with us for that long too. There's really nothing new under the sun in terms of commenting on that. Now, along these lines, a really intriguing, provocative article by the medical ethicist Ezekiel Manuel from The Atlantic in 2014, entitled "Why I Hope to Die at 75." Now, he was not actually saying that he's going to kill himself when he turns 75, but his basic point in the article was that he's not going to, he asserts, I will be curious to see if he follows this because he's not quite 75 yet, but he asserts that he will not do anything to unnecessarily prolong his life beyond that point. Why? Because he says, death is a loss, but living too long is also a loss. I would no longer be vibrant, engaged, but, quote, feeble, ineffectual, even pathetic. Aging, he asserts, brings a constricting of our ambitions and expectations, with memories framed not by our vivacity, but by our frailty. This is a really stark negative view of aging. I'm hoping most individuals 75 and above don't really view this. I tell you, I don't hear this. I hear the opposite. And I think Ezekiel Emanuel will be in for a pleasant surprise, perhaps, when he gets to 75. But he's doubled down on this. In fact, in our interview a number of years ago, he basically said, look, what people are doing beyond the age of 75 is not really meaningful. So this surprises me because of my clinical work. I see quite the opposite, which I want to present to you. But again, what he says is not new. In fact, let me give you this quote from the past. The end of life is upon me, and age descends I'm sorry, I have to, part of my screen is blocked by the thing, but the end of life is at hand, old age descends upon me, feebleness comes and childishness is renewed. He that lies down in misery every day, he that is old lies down in misery every day. The eyes are weak, the ears are deaf, the mouth is silent, he remembers not yesterday. These things does old age do for mankind, being evil in all things. I think this sounds almost like out of the mouth of Ezekiel Emanuel. The difference is this was written by Ptah-hotep, vizier to Pharaoh Assisi in 2450 BCE. So again, these viewpoints have been with us a long time. Shakespeare the same. Last scene of all, speaking about old age, that ends this strange eventful history is second childishness and mere oblivion. Sans teeth, sans eyes, sans taste, sans everything, from As You Like It. And Freud, same approach. He basically said that as people get above the age of 50, as he puts it, the elasticity of the mental process on which the treatment depends is as a rule lacking. Why? Because Freud asserted old people are no longer educable. And on the other hand, the massive material to be dealt with would prolong the duration of the treatment indefinitely. Now, it's unusual coming from a man who lived quite active into his 80s, as Freud did, until his death. But, Emanuel, again, is just saying what has been said since antiquity. But it's taking a really dark turn. And this article by Kent Russell came out in the New Republic a number of years ago called We Are Entering the Age of Alzheimer's Disease. And, he started off writing something I think is very true. In 1900, about 4% of the US population was older than 65. Today, 90% of all babies born in the developed world will live past that age. Barring a miracle cure, dementia will become the public health crisis of our time. And I would say it is now the public health crisis of our time. Alzheimer's disease is the single most expensive disease, more so than cancer, more so than heart disease. And it is at epidemic proportions to the point where at the age of 85, nearly 50% of the population has some degree of Alzheimer's disease. What troubled me is that Russell takes this a step further. And I would say, whether influenced or not, but certainly in the vein of all these other individuals I just quoted from antiquity to the current age, he said the following: scary, because dementia creates mindless, selfless, unreasonable creatures, somehow still looking like human beings that might as well be headless bodies up and shambling around. I don't think you could have a more dehumanizing view of individuals with Alzheimer's disease and other forms of dementia. These are individuals I see every day. They're loved ones to me and to many other people. And I think this is an unfortunate and a false characterization, and I want to talk about that. But nonetheless, these are many of the prevailing approaches to aging and attitudes. And this article went wholly unchallenged in the New Republic. I even offered to write some form of a commentary rebuttal to that, and was certainly not taken up on that. I just don't think it's right now, either people want something so happy like the bucket list, or they want something so awful like this. It's simply not a realistic view of the aging process. And again, it's not new. Thomas Jefferson wrote a letter to John Adams in 1816. Bodily decay is gloomy in prospect, but of all human contemplations, the most abhorrent is body without mind. We've had these concerns, again, throughout history. When are we going to finally get a more balanced view of the aging process that is not focusing to one extreme or the other? And I would say the modern day attempt in some ways began with Robert Butler. He was a world-renowned geriatrician, a researcher. His book, Why Survive Being Old in America, really changed the whole discussion. It came out, I think, in 1970. It won the Pulitzer Prize. He said survival is possible, but satisfaction and living elusive. And he was saying that the problem is the way we look at age, the way we denigrate it, has an impact on how we live it. And he's saying it's time that we begin to reevaluate that and to put things in place that are going to change how aging is. And we'll talk later about ageism and stigma, which really is what Robert Butler promoted. So let me just put this question. How do body and brain age in a way that gives us such a negative perspective, and what are we missing from that? So lots of theories on aging. I'm not going to go into detail tonight, but there's genetic theories, how aging is programmed. It's built in to what happens with our bodies. Wear and tear, over time, our DNA accumulates damage, our cells on the tissue level, and this damage becomes more and more irreversible. And disease on top of that leads to more irreparable damage. And so if you put all these factors together, it really represents what body and brain go through and why we see these changes, and why this really is a direct extension of the definition of aging that I began with. On the level of the brain, we see three things. I like to put it this way. Neurons get dirty, they do less, and they die. So as neurons build up cellular junk, just like other parts of the body, they do less. They produce fewer neurotransmitters. They transport them more slowly. Their metabolism sputters. They're less energetic, and neurons die. Atrophy is the rule, not the exception. And so you look at a brain over time, and it goes from a very plump organ to a somewhat withered organ, with everyone's brain in our 80s and 90s. And this is data from the Seattle Longitudinal Study on Aging. And basically what you see is that if you measure basic IQ skills, reasoning, verbal ability, numeric ability, word fluency, things like that, you find in any standard neuropsychological test or IQ test, our skills peak roughly between the ages of 30 and 60. And then we see moderate and then more severe declines as we get into our 60s, 70s, 80s, and 90s. And I can put up similar graphs for how fast people can run, how quickly your kidney or liver can detoxify your blood as you go through older cohorts. We tend to say, okay, this is aging. This is how we define aging. But keep in mind that it's a selective list of metrics. And, what are we missing from that? And that's what I'm going to come to very shortly. And what we experience is what we call our fluid intelligence, our problem solving, reasoning, logic, pattern recognition. This is what we really began to see slowing, actually starting in our 20s and thereafter. Our processing speed is slower. We have more of these tip of the tongue lapses. It's more difficult to inhibit or suppress distracting stimuli. And the brain is less efficient and slower at multitasking. So this is pretty much the rule, but keep in mind, if you look at skills, knowledge, experiences, these remain stable or increase over time. Our vocabulary increases, overall knowledge increases. So we have to look in the balance of this, and this is what gets lost in the discussion. We often don't look at what remains stable or can grow over time, and I'm going to focus on that very shortly. And of course, the main concern is that for too many people, what begins as normal or age-associated cognitive changes slowly morphs into mild cognitive impairment, morphs into dementia over time. And as I mentioned, by the age of 85, it's estimated almost 50% of the population has some degree of Alzheimer's disease. So these pessimistic, negative perspectives are not wrong. They're scientifically correct, but they're part of the story. And for many individuals, I would say for all individuals, we have to also consider other ways to look at it that balance this out. And I want to touch upon a really unique experience I had that really shaped how I began to think about the life cycle and how we change in mind over time. And this is a photo from, I think, 1982 and 1983. Actually, no, it's 1984. A young Dr. Agronin had an amazing experience of having a seminar with Erik Erikson, the great American psychologist and psychoanalyst. I was 19. He was, I think, 84, 85 at the time. A small seminar, about 10 people, just to talk about the life cycle. And, he was at the time very quiet. What I came to understand later is he himself was experiencing cognitive impairment. His wife, Joan, really spoke for him. But his presence had such a powerful impact on my life and the few things that he did talk about then that it really set me off on a different trajectory. He talked about different stages of what we call psychosocial development, that from infancy through childhood, school age, adolescence, and really was one of the first psychologists to talk about adulthood and how we continue to develop through into old age, that we face different important tasks that are brought on by society, brought on by the changes in our body, and how we navigate these has all the impact on successive stages and how successful we are or what challenges or fixations we have as we get older. For him, the last stage, we call the 8th stage of life, he talked about this balance between integrity and despair, where if we're able to have a sense of the wholeness and completeness of our life, to develop wisdom, this can offset the ego-dystonic sense of disgust and despair that many people get. And it's a balance, and hopefully one has built up enough resources throughout their lifetime to really have more of an ego-syntonic, strength-based approach. Unfortunately, as somewhat of a coda to his work, in the last book, largely written by Joan Erickson at a time when Eric was really ailing, they added what they call the 9th stage, when a person faces what they wrote as new demands, reevaluations, daily difficulties in their 80s and 90s. And they wrote the following: there's much sorrow to cope with, plus a clear announcement that death's door is open and not so far away. And they really cast despair as the dominant force at this point. I think this was not a well-developed stage. It was based largely on their own experience, but I think this is a fundamentally important phenomenon, because it really encapsulates a lot of the fears and concerns that people have. And I would say when we don't see the full balance of what happens as we age. And for them, the 9th stage is a time of severe physical and mental disorders, where pain, confusion, apathy, loss of interest and energy begins to carry the day when people become dependent on others. And the problem in this stage for too many is there's a loss of contact and dignity, of affection from others, loss of privacy. There's a terrible risk for individuals in this 9th stage of neglect and abuse, abandonment, dehumanization, especially when they're in situations which are unsafe or uncaring. To me, the failure here is not what we can do for individuals in this 9th stage. The failure is of our own attitudes and imagination, and that's what I want to address in the next part of the talk. Because when we internalize these negative beliefs and attitudes and stereotypes, it impacts how we view our own aging, how we view aging of others, and how we make decisions about the aging process. As Thomas Cole, who is a geriatrician in Texas, writes, how we view old age constitutes old age. So what we think of it often has an incredible influence on what it becomes for too many people. This is a friend of mine, a physician who turned 50, and they gave him through a birthday party and gave him all these gag gifts: the over-the-hill hat, Dr. Decrepit's over-the-hill survival kit, the 50 Sucks candy flavored lollipops, the old geezer lost your marbles replacement pack. And if you survey these gag gifts and cards, how we look at, from a social perspective, aging, they're wholly negative. Focus on us as prehistoric, as decrepit, as barely capable. And so, and I think this is widespread. We tend to have a very negative view on the aging process, stemming from whether it's the scientific definition, how people look at it socially, the attitudes you read in journals, whatever. This begins to have a really nefarious effect on how we look at the aging process. And this is where ageism comes into play, and stigma, which is what Robert Butler talked about. And we get stuck here. And we get stuck because we can't see beyond this. And many of us have experiences or we have loved ones who have experiences which seem to confirm all of this. And it takes away our motivation and our imagination and often our determination to make a difference there. So let me begin to give a different script here, because we need to look at the other side of the story. And I'm going to pose a question which will begin this discussion. And this is the question: when do you think you made better decisions in your life, now or when you were 18 years old? And my guess is most people unanimously will say, well, of course now. Not when I was 18, but at 18, I was impulsive and reckless, or, why is that? The 18-year-old brain is about as nimble and viable and pulsating with life and energy as it's ever going to be. And I would add the 18-year-old body to that. So why is it now, with people say in their 50s, 60s through their 90s, that they make better decisions? Clearly, aging is giving us changes, these strengths that we talked about with Matisse that make a difference. So let's explore those in more detail. So what are these strengths? I want to spend some time talking about wisdom, resilience, purpose, and creativity. So another amazing experience I had, which along with Erickson really shaped my life. And this was spending time with Gene Cohen. He was a geriatric psychiatrist, actually one of the founders of my own trade organization, the American Association for Geriatric Psychiatry. He was a true Renaissance man, an extraordinary individual. And I had the life-changing opportunity to spend some time with him shortly before he passed away. This was a day he literally invited me over to his house outside Washington, D.C. I would tell you the person who walked onto that porch was not the person who left a few hours later. Unbeknownst to me, he was so generous that I didn't realize how ill he was and actually passed away about 3 months later. But he imparted to me through his just discussions, his presence, his writings, an approach to aging that has stuck with me and has allowed me to understand and develop over time. When he was a young resident, this is at a time during what's called deinstitutionalization, where individuals who had lived for years in psychiatric institutions throughout the 60s into the early 70s, suddenly they changed the policy and said, no longer. We're getting these people out of the institutions. Unfortunately, many ended up on the streets, but the goal was at least to get them into other type of housing situations as opposed to just being institutionalized. And he was sent to work at a low-income housing unit in Washington, D.C. for seniors, many of whom had chronic mental illness. And he chose to go there. And colleagues, physicians really said, oh my God, what are you doing? Why do you want to do that? And when he expressed an interest in working with older individuals, one of his mentors said, you really need to go into psychotherapy as a patient. They were really shocked at this. But as the type of person Gene Cohen was, this is what he wrote. He said, instead of what others warned would be the most depressing of patients, these elderly women and men proved to be among the most alert, attentive, and responsive, a satisfying kind of patient for a doctor who cares. To me, Gene Cohen was certainly not the first, but I think in the modern time, one of the most, in some ways, revolutionary individuals who was able to see a different perspective on aging, fully acknowledging everything we've talked to up to this point, recognizing the challenges, the difficulties that every single person faces as they get older, endorsing the scientific definition we opened the talk with, but also having a whole different perspective as well on what was still there. And one of the things he talked about, and there's been a growing literature, is on wisdom. And so I want to make the point that as a strength of aging, wisdom is something that always grows and comes in many different forms. With time, our brains continue to develop. We build up what we call our brain reserve. That's simply the number of brain connections, the number of synapses. We also build up what's called cognitive reserve, our intelligence, our skills, our experiences. And what many people don't realize is that the older brain is still very plastic. It's able to adapt. It's able to resculpt itself. And two really interesting things happen. Older brains are able to recruit more brain circuits, and they also use both hemispheres more. Now, some people look at this as a weakness. It's like saying, instead of picking up the weight with one hand, I need to use my whole body because I'm not as strong. Then again, when you use your whole body as opposed to one hand, you have, in some ways, you're more versatile in how you pick something up and how you move it through the air. Similarly, with our brains, younger brains using select areas for problem solving, for dealing with, coping. Older brains bring in many more regions, both by necessity, but also because they can. And this gives a distinct advantage in many different areas to the older brain that we often neglect. And let me talk about three distinct changes that our minds develop with aging. One is called post-formal thinking. And I'll give you a brief definition. I'll talk a little more in detail, but it's basically, we think in more pragmatic and practical ways as we get older. We're less reactive, less rigid, less impulsive, contrary to stereotypes. Social emotional selectivity, I'm going to talk a little more detail in a minute. Literally, the older mind prefers more positive experiences, and it gravitates towards more meaningful goals and activities. And a term coined by Gene Cohen called developmental intelligence, where we combine our cognition, emotion, judgment, and social skills into a more balanced and integrated whole. So let me talk a little bit more about each one, because put together, this is how we define wisdom. So post-formal thinking really comes out of Piaget's model, the Swiss psychologist who literally studied his own children and to develop this first scheme of cognitive development as we age. But what Piaget said is that when you reach basically young adulthood, we're in some ways a fully developed mind. We develop what's called formal operations, the ability to think abstractly. And since then, there's been a great deal of research by many cognitive sciences proposing what's sometimes called post-formal thinking, sometimes called dialectical thinking. And it basically refers to the adult brain's ability to, as I write here, understand and compare competing sets of relationships or systems. Our thinking becomes more relative and less universal. What is it? What do we mean by that? We have a better appreciation of the tension between our own perspective and that of other people or other systems. And the result is that we think in ways that are maybe less logical to some extent, but they're more pragmatic. And combine this with what's called, and so what Gene Cohn wrote about this is, I love this quote. He said, post-formal reason helps integrate the subjective and the objective, feeling and thinking, the heart and the mind, and how as we get older, we have what he calls a developmental impetus that energizes creativity, jumpstarts our efforts to explore new ideas or make desired changes. We don't look at a description like this of older brains, but this is indeed what science shows us is happening as we get older. The problem is we often don't realize it or take advantage of it to the extent that we could. Stanford psychologist Laura Carstensen has done fundamental research in what she calls the socio-emotional selectivity theory. And basically what she says is that as we get older, we see the horizon of life approaching. We reprioritize. We have a greater preference for more positive experiences. We gravitate towards more meaningful goals and activities. And the result, which research shows over and over again, is that older individuals, contrary to stereotypes, are generally happier and have less mental illness. We tend to think the opposite. I can tell you as a psychiatrist working across the lifespan that in general, outside of major medical illnesses, rates of depression go down, contrary to stereotypes. And finally, what Gene Cohn writes is that, as we mature, our cognition, our emotional intelligence, our judgment, our social skills, our life experience, all of this is better integrated. It has synergy. And this stems right from the neurobiological changes I talked about earlier, where if you watch what older brains do, they tend to be more integrative. They use more regions of the brain. They have better use of both hemispheres simultaneously. And so we see both on a biological level and on a neuropsychological level this process happening, which actually lends strengths to the older mind. And put together, wisdom is something that doesn't just come to us. It comes from reflecting upon life, applying practical knowledge. It's not a single trait, but what I want to talk about for a few minutes is the fact that if you look at the literature on wisdom, similar to the literature on intelligence, it definitely has different components and different forms of it, which we need to appreciate. Wisdom serves a higher purpose. It's shared with other people, which is the beautiful thing about it, and speaks to the need for older minds to be active vitally in society and in families and communities. There are cultural variations, but as I mentioned a moment ago, there are neurobiological underpinnings, which gives us a scientific validity to this notion of wisdom. And so let me put this in a very practical way that I really take this from the literature on wisdom. Think about, how does aging change us? Well, time brings us knowledge, experience, and skills. We talked about that crystallize intelligence. We learn lessons over time. This enhances our judgment. It forces us to persevere. People face failure, and this ideally leads to a greater sense and a deepening sense of humility, of gratitude, of empathy for others. We all have ambitions, and this motivates us to create and build, to want to have a legacy. And with the approach of death, the rule is it brings acceptance and insight and a deepened spirituality for so many people. So if you take these key words here, knowledge, judgment, empathy, creativity, acceptance, the literature on wisdom, and this is a scheme I put in my book, The End of Old Age, it gives us 5 different forms of wisdom, and I've given each one a name: savant, sage, curator, creator, seer. And what I found in the literature is that these different types of wisdom we all have in different batches. But as an exercise, what's fascinating to do is sit and think about, what's my savant wisdom? What do I do that shows my accumulated knowledge, experience, and skills? Am I an expert at something, a humorist, a master of craft, a storyteller? What about sage wisdom, this broad and balanced perspective that we talked about? How do you give sage advice to people? Do you work as a mentor, a guide, a coach, a docent? To me, curator wisdom is this empathy and caring for others and for cultural items. And these are individuals who work as guardians and caretakers and judges and stewards later in life, and often are better at this than younger individuals. Creator wisdom is this notion of wanting to build, to create, to innovate through artistry, crafts, exploration, hobbies. And finally, seer wisdom, this deepened sense of acceptance and spirituality and transcendence. And these are individuals can bring this to volunteer work and counseling and being spiritual leaders. These are the opportunities people have. We need this wisdom especially in post-retirement stages for people, which now can encompass 20, 30, 40 years. Even in the ninth stage, even in the face of Alzheimer's disease and other forms of neurocognitive disorders, people retain forms of wisdom. It changes, but it's there. Savant wisdom is in the retention, especially of long-term memories and knowledge and skills, and people can still serve as a witness, as a repository of information, as an icon. Sage wisdom may just be someone's presence as a matriarch or patriarch of a family. Curator wisdom are people who are cultural icons, and they represent a historical area or cultural history or tradition. Creator wisdom is there. Sometimes people need more stimulation, motivation, or guidance, but they can produce incredible art. They can do incredible exploration. And for seer wisdom, sometimes it's just the presence of someone. If you've ever been around a spiritual icon, their influence can be as great as when they were younger. These individuals have an enormous impact across the board. I work with families where my patient who has advanced dementia is the matriarch or patriarch of family, and they're the glue that keeps it together. And I've seen when they pass away, the families fall apart. Individuals who are witnesses to history. Look, if you look at the picture under curator, it's a picture a friend took of an honor flight where individuals from World War II, Korea, Vietnam War are given a free trip. They're flown up to Washington, D.C. They're celebrated for the day. They're taken around to all the monuments. They're brought home, and volunteers take them on this trip. And this is a photo of a World War II veteran being wheeled through the airport. And look at the way people are just celebrating them. I've seen this before. I've been in the airport when they've come through, and it's one of the most moving experiences. We don't care about what person can do or say. Their presence substitutes for any performance. The process of connecting to them in any way substitutes for any productivity that we typically measure a person's worth on. So when Ezekiel Emanuel says that what people do later in life has no meaning, I say that is absolutely false, because everyone here can think of someone older in life who is debilitated, facing all the age-associated issues and problems that we all face, but is having an amazing impact on us and on other individuals because of this wisdom and presence and meaning that's still there. And wisdom, we know that is associated with increased well-being, better life satisfaction, better relationships, adjustment to aging, lower levels of depression. Wisdom is an amazingly powerful element that we all need more of in our lives and those of our loved ones. Gerotranscendence refers to this final stage. This is developed by Lars Torstam, who's a Scandinavian social gerontologist. He talks about how people get it to a stage where time is seen more as a moment instead of a horizon, that they're able to live in the moment and have this wonderful transcendent view of their life. They're better able to understand and cope with the approaching end of life because of this. It's sort of a final stage of maturation and wisdom that he talks about. Resilience is something which improves as we learn how to cope and adapt to adversity. And we know that even though older individuals may be more physically vulnerable, they're more psychologically resilient. We see this in lower rates of post-traumatic stress disorder, as an example, after crimes and accidents or national catastrophes. And one way people are resilient is along the lines of what the gerontologist Paul Baltes talked about, how people are able to be more selective in what they do. They're able to optimize their abilities and compensate. And he gives the example of the pianist Arthur Rubinstein, who, when asked how he still gave such great performance, he said, more selective in what I do, which pieces I perform. I need to practice a lot more. And he said, I compensate. So maybe there's a part of the performance that needs to be played very rapidly, and I may play it louder or play it in a different way to compensate for a little bit of loss in dexterity, but it gives it often a deeper meaning and different feel to it. And this is something which we all can do in whatever activities, but these are skills we need to learn and to appreciate in order to feel good about what we do and have similar purpose and meaning even when things change. In my book, I write about what I call an age point. And basically, an age point is when we face some momentous events, a trauma, a change in life, which exposes this gap between what we've always seen as our abilities and demands of the situation. And often, maybe a major loss, retirement, illness. Often people get in the state of what I call suspension. They're paralyzed, they stagnate, they're fixated on ways of doing things that aren't working anymore. And they often withdraw into themselves, into singular tasks. into negative attitudes, sometimes into substance use. Ideally, people can get out of this. They go through a reckoning period where they weigh their options. Then they have to let go of things from the past, come up with alternate scripts to come to some sort of resolution. It's a new role, a new script in life, a greater tolerance for certain things. And I will give you an illustration of the life of Martha Graham, the famous dancer. So Martha Graham, for 50 years, was an absolutely, revolutionary figure in American dance. I mean, she literally created modern dance. And this is a photograph of her from around 1940. And just, she was such an innovative, amazing person. And she not only was the creator of the dance, but she was the dancer herself. When she was in her 70s, she was no longer able to dance in the way she could. Age declined her ability to dance in such amazing ways, and she wasn't wanted as much. The dance troupes, the places that would have dancers, they wanted younger people to do this. This was a major loss and trauma for her. She started drinking too much, became very depressed, and made a suicide attempt by taking an overdose. Ended up in the hospital in a coma. So she's lying in bed, and as with Matisse, something really remarkable happened. A memory came back to her. And I just want to read just a little selection here. This is from a book she wrote about her life. And this is what she wrote. She was lying in bed, just recuperating from coming out of a coma. She said, "Then one morning, I felt something welling up within me. I knew that I would bloom again. That feeling, an errand into the maze, over and over in my mind, sustained me to go on. It was the only way to escape the constant fear of what might come." Basically, she had a recollection of a dance she created, something called an errand into the maze. And basically what this dance is about is the dancer faces the Greek mythological creature, the Minotaur, this half man, half bull figure. And in the dance, this scared dancer is able to go through a number of different dances with the Minotaur, finally to triumph over him. And for her, this was symbolic of how she can triumph over her illness. And she, had to sum up courage, a sense of purpose, a sense of survival. What was her resolution? She became a producer, a choreographer, an icon in dance, even though she was not the dancer, and literally lived until, the age of 97, died a few weeks before one of her pieces were performed to amazing acclaim. But a perfect example, like Matisse, of someone who was able to draw upon all these strengths of aging to really make a difference. So a few more things I want to talk about. I'll go about 5 minutes over. So purpose, a sense of purpose emerges from adversity. It helps to improve wellness and longevity. There's something called the Matisse cohort, the midlife in the US. It's a group, a cohort of older individuals that have been studied. And what they found, amongst many other things, is that people with a sense of purpose live longer. People with a sense of purpose have reduced risk for cardiovascular events. They have longer mortality. A lot of this comes from the work of Becca Levy, a Yale psychologist. She's developed something called the stereotype embodiment theory. And basically, she's saying that what you think you are is what you become. So people who have more positive views of aging literally have better health, a 30 to 40% reduced risk for dementia. In one study, they live up to 7 years longer. It's really extraordinary. And the flip side, people with a more negative view of aging have poorer health, poorer function, shorter lives. So it's really stunning how this sense of purpose and attitude can make a difference. And this Counter Clockwise study by Ellen Langer is a perfect example. Basically, she took 7 men in 1981, measured all these biological aspects of them, how quickly they can walk, their blood pressure, their visual acuity, their hearing, put them in a van, drove them up to this old monastery in New Hampshire for a week. And when they arrived, the entire place was outfitted like it was 1959. The furniture, the music, the magazines, and she basically told these aging men, you will live like it's 1959 for the next week. And they did, and they had a ball. At the end of the week, she brought them out, measured all the same indices. Now remember, it's not 1959, it's actually 1981. And what did she find? Literally, their bodies seemed younger in terms of their gait, their posture, their vision and hearing. Cognitive scores improved. Literally, their body and brain seemed to impersonate their mind. And the point here is not that we should be like we're younger or pretend like we're younger, live like we're younger. It's that how we view ourselves, how we imagine and think about aging or attitudes towards it has a profound impact on how we age. And that's really the point. And finally, creativity is really essential. And we know Gene Cohen said we tend to think of creativity as diminishes as people are less physically dexterous. They're less willing to try new things out. He found the opposite. In fact, in a fascinating way, he went to the Corcoran Museum of Art in 1980. This is an exhibit of major American folk artists. He noted that 80% of the 20 exhibitors had started their art or reached a mature phase after the age of 65, and literally 30% were 80 or older. And so, someone like Grandma Moses is really representative of how creativity can continue to grow and change as we get older. And what Cohen says is that the secret is that creativity can be at any age, but aging gives us this richness of experience, as he puts it, that magnifies the possibilities tremendously. This is what happened with Matisse. It happened with Martha Graham. It's happened with so many. We all have that potential. And it's not just for artists, whether it's in relationships, responding to adversity, working across generations. Creativity is something we use and do every single day. And again, aging gives it strengths and advantages. He talks about potential phases. I don't want to take the time to talk about this, only to say that as opposed to talking about stages of life in which we're declining, he talked about stages of life in which we have more potential. From midlife to what he calls the encore phase in our late 70s is on, we're able to bring this energy to reevaluate, explore, recapitulate, innovate, experiment, celebrate, that these are actually as equal components of aging as all the opposite that we talk about. So finally, how to age with strength. Let me give you an action plan and then we're going to end. So obviously, exercise, a diet rich in fruits and vegetables, brain stimulation, keeping our brains. I'm not going to, all this, you've had speakers in this, I'm not going to touch on this, but obviously you need to have a brain healthy lifestyle. That's an important part of it. You can age well without this, but you better have really good genetics. But we can game the system through all these things. Not the point of my talk, but I definitely wanted to put that in. But I would say, think about your life portfolio and what's in it. You need wisdom as your assets. You need resilience as your insurance. You need purpose to invest in new things. You need creativity to diversify. And when people learn and focus on identifying and sharing their wisdom, on still learning, on expanding the social connections, on learning to adapt, on starting new initiatives, and getting involved in the arts as an observer or participant, helping other people, getting involved in volunteer work, they find that they're able to fully identify and reap these strengths of aging, and it can make all the difference for them, their families, their communities, their relationships, for all of us. Even if we call, an Alzheimer's life portfolio, people still have wisdom, as we talked about. They can socialize, they can tell stories, they can make choices and assert themselves and be resilient. They can still help others, and sensory stimulation can get people moving and enjoying art and music and aromatherapy and pets and nature to have a sense of purpose. They can be involved in storytelling and creativity and exploration to have a sense of creativity. So there is still so much meaning and purpose even in those states. The issue is not whether it's there. The issue is, do we even have an attitude towards aging? Do we even recognize this element of aging, to even consider these factors and take them seriously to really make a difference for us? And in the end, what we find is that, this is a survey done of several 100,000 people from age 18 to 85. They asked the question, how stressed out are you? As opposed to this notion that if old age is just about, depression and decline and decrepitude, you think you'd be pretty stressed out. And actually what they found is that levels of stress drop precipitously and were lowest at age 85. So, we look at these downward skills of something that's bad. This is the opposite. This is where you want to be on the downward slope. When they looked at a sense of well-being, what they found is we start off pretty well. We dip and hit a low point in our 50s. But the greatest sense of well-being, the 85-year-olds, again, this is based on surveys of hundreds of thousands of individuals, and this has been replicated in many different studies. My point being that there is study after study after study to scientifically validate these strengths of aging, not in exclusion to all the other aspects of aging, but in addition to that we need to use to balance this out. And finally, we cannot forget that this leads us to redefine aging. So let's go back to our initial definition, and I'm going to put a new cast on it based on what I've talked about tonight. So we can equally say that aging is a time-dependent series of cumulative, progressive, intrinsic, and positive cognitive, emotional, and behavioral changes that usually begin to manifest themselves in midlife and eventually culminate in increased well-being. This definition of aging is as scientifically valid as the first one we began to talk with, but it balances out. And we have the choice to decide which one are we going to focus on in our own lives, with our loved ones, with our patients, to bring in that other perspective. And finally, never forget, celebrate aging. We have so many rituals for youth, for middle age. By the time we get to later stage in life, we're stuck with these stupid cards and gag gifts poking fun at aging. Let's do the opposite. Let's focus on our wisdom, on what we achieve, on our strengths, and think about how that makes such a difference, because this is the most remarkable thing. A more positive view lowers our risk of dementia. We live longer. We have greater well-being in ways that are as powerful, if you look at the data, in many respects, as diet, exercise, and so many other factors. So let me leave you this quote, poem by Henry Wadsworth Longfellow he gave to his class of college after many years at a reunion. He concluded the poem by saying the following: "For age is opportunity no less than youth itself, though in another dress. And as the evening twilight fades away, the sky is filled with stars, invisible by day." He's making the point that this view of aging is there. It's right in front of us. It's always existed. We have to choose if we see it. And if we see it and recognize that we need to build on it and balance out. It's not a cure for aging. That's not the point. It's not going to take away the sorrow, the losses, the changes that we face and we struggle with, but it will give us moments of purpose, of meaning, of joy that we all need and we need to balance out. So with that, I thank you so much for your attention. Everything I talked about is from, I wrote about this in How We Age and the End of Old Age. Again, it's been such an honor to speak to everyone here. I really appreciate your time and attention. I'm so really impressed and so excited about what the Institute is doing and looking forward to this. And David, thank you so much for this opportunity.
Mark, thanks for being here tonight. Wish you a healthy and peaceful holiday season. And I'm just very grateful also that you're part of the Atria Academy and part of the Atria family here. So thank you for your time. Thank you for your expertise. And thank you for doing what you do.